Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
It is impossible to think about Bollywood and Indian cinema without the dancing and the song. And for the better part of Indian cinema's existence, it's women dancing who have been in the spotlight. Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Author and scholar Usha Iyer talks to dancer Purna Swami on the role that women and dance have played in Indian cinema, the dynamics, and the people. Usha recently wrote the book Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema. Hi Usha, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks all the way from Northern California.
Thanks so much, Pavan. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on this podcast.
And welcome back, Purna. You're our favorite guest host, and I'm glad that you're here to talk to Usha after your previous discussions on BIC Talks with Rahul Rao and Ani Zaidi.
Thanks, Pavan. I'm flattered and it's good to be back.
And the show is all yours.
Hi, Usha. It's really great to talk to you about this very, very illuminating book that covers so many decades of dance history on screen in Hindi cinema. And so I thought that maybe, because it's such a big book, maybe we could just start by talking about the big picture. And I was wondering if you could tell me about how did we get here? Where did all this dancing in Bollywood come from?
Thanks, Purna. It's really great to be talking with you, and it'll be interesting to speak with someone who has a history in performance and dance herself. So the minute you say Bollywood or Indian cinema, and sometimes those are synonymous, but we know they are not. And that's my biggest kind of project in every Indian cinema class I teach. I tell them if there's one thing you'll take away, it's that Bollywood is not equal to Indian cinema. But the first thing that people think of around the world when you mention these popular cinematic formations from India is the big budget song and dance spectacle, whether from the 50s onwards all the way now to the big budget item numbers. I don't know if there's one particular kind of prehistory to this, but I trace it back to multiple influences. One of them for me that is really interesting for me is the Nautch Girl and the figure of the hereditary dancer as well. So there was a kind of hectic scene of dancing in, a pre-cinematic dancing scene in 19th century, early 20th century India. So the Parsi theatre, which was the kind of one of the precursors to popular Indian cinema, included plays on stage, miracles, they included comic routines, and they included song numbers, song sequences, dance numbers. And so the cinema takes from that. Popular cinema is also taking from folk theatre forms like Nautanki, Jatra. It's definitely influenced by Devadasi performance routines. And so these multiple performance cultures around the cinema actually feed into the cinema. And women are at the center of those performance cultures. So when the gramophone is introduced in India, the first artists to record on the gramophone are women, and they are from the Tawayef lineage. So these are our artistic pioneers, and through their training, they bring what then becomes, say, Hindustani or Carnatic classical music or Bharatanatyam or Kathak, etc., to popular culture. So by thinking about cinema, we also break away from those binaries or triad formations of classical, folk, popular. There is a lot of dance in silent or pre-sound cinema as well. So it's not as if dance just erupts with sound cinema in the 1930s. And I spent some time in the introduction. That would call for a separate book of its own. I spent some time thinking about the kind of dance and how it's shot in pre-sound film, because the book is also thinking about what dance does to cinema as a technology, as an aesthetic form. The minute you have a dancing body on screen, it changes how cinema itself is formed, how film technology must capture this dancing body.
So one of the propositions in your book is that song and dance, they aren't separate things, and we tend to think about song as, being the precursor to dance, and you question that proposition, and you talk about how maybe it was dance that at times, determined the songs and therefore determined how we remember our most beloved films. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Most of us know this. It's a journalistic term called song picturization, which is that the song is recorded and then you figure out what to do with the bodies on screen in response, in sync with the song, with the recorded song, with the playback singers, the musicians. That process happens separately in the sound studio. And so the on-screen picturization hasn't been parsed carefully enough. What's a taxonomy that centers the performing body rather than this kind of simplistic notion of the song being recorded and the image following after it? The minute you have a trained dancer on screen, I use the example of Vaijayanthimala, but this is true of so many of our dancers. If you have Madhuri Dixit performing in a film, you're not going to waste quote unquote Madhuri Dixit just standing by a tree and pining and singing for a lost love or whatever the narrative context might be. You're going to make her do a big dance number, even to express sorrow. So the argument is I propose this phrase called dance musicalization. And it's not to replace song picturization, but it's to add new ways of thinking about dance on screen. So in dance musicalization, I say when a trained dancer or when an accomplished, the training is not actually the central thing. When someone who's famed for their dancing abilities is signed on to a film, the entire film changes its shape. And the music definitely changes because now you will record certain kinds of music, whether it's in a folk idiom, a classical idiom, a Western idiom. So the minute you have Helen in a film, you're going to choose a certain kind of music composer, or definitely at least one song that will address and try and do things with Helen's dancing body. So it changed the style of music. It often might determine the music composer. It definitely determined the kinds of stories that were written around these dancing bodies. So when Vaijayanthimala moves from the Madras film industry to the Bombay film industry in the 50s, suddenly the Bombay film industry has to contend with this Bharatanatyam trained dancer. And so you have sets in the background, for example, in New Delhi or Asha or Pehli Jhalak. These are really delightful comedies from the 1950s. You have a Gopuram in the background, because how do you kind of signal that this is a South Indian body, a new body for Bombay cinema, right? So her dancing body then changes art direction. It brings the Amrapali costume into Hindi cinema, this kind of, bustier and harem pants, Bharatanatyam costume, but kind of modified in a cinematic idiom. So dance musicalization makes us think about various narrative and technological changes that the dancing body kind of presses upon a film industry.
But of course, this dancing body is very specifically gendered. It is the women's body. And I was thinking about, what really happens with the men, because you talk about kind of a star culture around these dancing women. And the industry today is star-driven, but it's largely male star-driven. So how has this cinema been shaped by dancing women versus dancing men? I mean, if they dance at all.
The gendering of performance has shifted over time. So until the 40s, it was often the actress who got the lead billing in films. So Sadhana Bose, who I write about, would often get the lead billing, and she kind of refused to sign a film where Sehgal wanted to be billed alongside her, the credits of the film. And she just refused to act with him, and so they had to replace him with another actor. It's only since the 50s that the hero, the male actor, kind of the male star gets top billing. And by the 80s, the stories kind of edge out the female protagonist. She's often present only in song and dance sequences and is kind of incidental to the rest of the narrative. What has also shifted is the gendering of on-screen dancing. So it's only from the 90s and in fact the 2000s that you have male stars routinely dancing. And it's because you have trained dancers like Shahid Kapoor or Hrithik Roshan, now part of the film industry. Now dancing is just a prerequisite to be a Bollywood actor. And everyone goes to Bollywood dance classes. And it starts with Shamak Davar's, I think, dance training, his dance institute. But in an earlier period, there are very few male dancers on whom they will dance probably in what I call a narrative number, which is kind of a romantic number, what we call in journalistic discourse as dancing around the trees, disparagingly, but it doesn't require a lot of virtuosity, dancing virtuosity. But the solo dance numbers where the entire kind of, it's what I call a production number, or even a pure dance number where there's no song, but you're only capturing this kind of amazing dancing body on screen, was often centered on women until the 1990s. I have another article coming out in an edited volume, which is called From Bhagwan to Bachchan, and it's about the male dancing body. And this is to think about why comedy was always introduced into solo male dancing. So if you think of Master Bhagwan, the star of Albela from 1951, a delightful dancer, and he has something called the Bhagwan step. Amitabh Bachchan then kind of recreates that in the 70s. And then you have the odd dancers. You have Kishore Kumar, Shammi Kapoor, Jitendra, Mithun Chakrabarti. These are the kind of, and Kamal Hassan, who comes from the South with his Bharatanatyam training as well. But often with Kishore Kumar, Bachchan, Bhagwan, it's comic. The kind of idiom in which they're dancing is comic. And this is to kind of take away from the spectacularization of the male body. So this kind of gaze that is trained upon the singular, the solo dancing body is often a troubling gaze because it forces us to look at the body in certain ways, right? And I think about that alongside the dancing female body, which is often, if you talk about theories of the male gaze, the dancing woman, the showgirl, has often been argued to just be a passive, fetishistic object for the male gaze. And through your earlier question, for example, about dance musicalization, I'm kind of trying to shift that terrain. I'm not saying it's purely either an oppressed body or an agentive body, but it's a constantly shifting terrain of agency and subjection. But the male body has to kind of resist this kind of objectifying gaze, and comedy is another kind of route that helps do that. And that has completely changed, which is why the book ends in the 90s, because things have changed so dramatically in the past 20 years that we need entirely different lenses to think about it.
When you're talking about these bodies, and particularly the way in which we think about the morality of women through their bodies, because I think that's really what you're getting at. I don't think men are subjected to quite the same moral yardstick in cinema then or now. And you talk about in your book how at one point the female dancing body was synonymous with the vamp, and then you had the vampish woman do the cabaret number. Yeah, really, where did that come from, and how did that change? Because it has changed.
The vamp is such an interesting formation, and kind of popular narratives of the vamp start typically with Helen in the late 1950s and might trace back to Cuckoo, another Anglo-Indian Eurasian dancer who trained Helen. I was interested in seeing who are the women before that. There is a rich culture in the 1920s. The sad thing about pre-sound Indian cinema is that we hardly have any of it. A very small percentage of silent films survive. So we kind of base our narratives on song booklets, on all these other texts that survive, little paper booklets about the films. But the 1920s and 30s was in a mode called the bazaar cinema, which had, the Nautch girl, the Eurasian. There were many women either passing through India during this colonial period who were performing in the circus, who were performing alongside. Silent cinema was often shown as one of many attractions. So there would often be a dance performed on stage, and then a film would be screened, there would be a magic performance, etc. Right? So Fearless Nadia, Australian, Greek, British, Indian, is one of those early spectacular figures. She was a dancer herself before she's figured as Fearless Nadia, this kind of stunt heroine in the Wadia films. So the dancing woman in this vamp kind of mode has been present for a very long time. I'm actually interested even in a further prehistory where the Devadasis were already kind of part of this modern colonial kind of fusion, kind of performative fusion. So they would have, as part of their repertoire, was something called Notiswaram, which was a kind of Irish marching band tune that was included in their repertoire. So we don't have these clear boundaries between the 19th and the 20th century, between Bharatanatyam and or the Tavaev's Kathak and Mudra and the cinematic vamp. The most interesting figure for me that I have been able to find through archival research is Azuri. And in some of the blogs that helped me kind of think about her, they call her the first item dancer of Indian cinema. So you see there a connection between the vamps.
And she was only half Indian, right?
She was born in Bangalore, in fact. Her mother was Hindu and her father was German Jewish. Her name was Anna Marie Gazeller, and then she's renamed Azuri. So yeah, she's somebody who hides from her, her father was very strict and wanted her to learn the ballet and piano, but she goes off with her ayah secretly to watch films and learns dance from there. But she brings, again, a really kind of cosmopolitan vocabulary to dance. And very few of her films survive. So I kind of am also reconstructing this through journalistic accounts, through song booklets. So the vamp has this long history, and I spent some time thinking about the cabaret as both a dance style and a space of dancing. And Helen is among the most famous. She actually produces the cabaret almost as a form in Hindi cinema. So, a standard way of thinking about these would be, it's a side story. Helen is hardly even given a name in her films. She's often killed off. But a big part of the budget of the film was set aside for these cabaret numbers. A huge amount of time was set aside for rehearsing the dance, for producing these extravagant sets that had slides and swings and walls painted with flamingos. And the camera and editing were the most experimental in these cabaret numbers. So if we just train our vision, it's not, it's a way of looking. And if you train that way of looking at spectacle, at spectacle as productive, at spectacle as interesting ideologically and in terms of our own pleasure that we derive from it, we kind of tell a very different story of the vamp. The dance musicalization for the vamp also had to be special. You couldn't have certain singers sing for the vamp. And even a singer like Asha Bhosle or Geeta Dutt had to produce a certain kind of voice and timbre when they were singing for the vamp. Helen would apparently send a bouquet to Asha Bhosle on days that she was recording for her. And she would say, remember, you're singing for me today. So if you need Helen to slink and slide and slither, you need Asha Bhosle's voice to also kind of capture that corporeality of her movement. So the vamp is really an interesting figure for us to think about and to recover as among the most experimental dancing bodies in Hindi cinema.
Through all of what you've been saying, one thing becomes apparent that in order to be a good vamp, you have to have a certain kind of virtuosity, in the same way that Vaijayanti Mala had to have a particular kind of virtuosity. And when you look at the spectacle and the virtuosity within it, you really focus on the body. Even through our conversation, you don't refer to them as dancers, but as dancing bodies, bodies that sweat, that work hard, possibly even make mistakes. So why do you think it's so important for us to think about, these glamorous film songs through this, in some ways, very focused frame of a body that you can touch and feel?
I think it's important because, one, this wasn't a book about the great dancers of Hindi cinema. It's not like a listing and a hagiographic kind of celebration. It is a celebration, but it's a celebration of their labor, of the amount of training and rehearsal it took, and not just about their body. So I talk about the choreo musicking body. The dancing body that we see on screen is a technological invention, right? It actually kind of brings in the labor, the sweat of many, many bodies. It brings in, most obviously, the playback singer. So the playback singer and the on-screen dancer form what is called a dual star text, right? Helen's body would not be the same without Asha Bhosle's playback singing. And likewise for Asha Bhosle's singing, she wouldn't have had an opportunity to be inventive if she was only singing for the heroine, who is this virtuous and often not moving as much kind of figure on screen. But there are also these bodies behind the dancing heroine or vamp, the backup dancers, the people who construct the sets, the carpenters, the painters, the dresswalas who create these amazing costumes for the dancing body as well as the backup bodies. And then the cinematographer, the light boys, the nameless musicians who are also in the music, the sound studio recording the song, editors, editing assistants, all of these. When we switch our kind of gaze from certain stars who just happen to be amazing dancers to thinking about labor, we then think about a whole other set of bodies that are hidden. These are ghost figures, these are shadow bodies. And I just felt it was part of the ethical work of recovering the work of dance was to not center it on singular figures, which is exactly the problem with heteropatriarchal history, right? It's about great men. It's about the great directors of Indian cinema. What gets lost there is the labor of all the other people. And film history especially should be doing this kind of work because we know cinema is a collaborative industrial form. But I'm hoping we can take this notion of the choreo-musicking body to other kind of fields that are thought of as emerging from the solo genius of one mind, like an individual dance performance on stage, a novel, a philosophical treatise. What are the many bodies that labored silently for a philosopher to write often his philosophical treatise. So it's a way of accounting for many bodies. It helps us tell labor histories, what is the behind the scenes work, which also then helps us think about the pride. In addition to labor, there is joy, pleasure, and pride. I think, we've spoken so often about exploitation of the dancing woman or just of women in the film industry. I wanted to actually think about both my pleasure. Why does a feminist find pleasure in the item number or in the Vamps Cabaret and find great pleasure? That those are often the only things you remember. The only thing I remember from Jewel Thief is the Hoto Pe Aisi Baat song by Vaijayantimala, right? And your body starts moving the minute you think about that song. Or if I think about Shah Rukh Khan and Darte Disco. There is, what comes to mind is his torso. What comes to mind are those backup dancers emerging out of the fire, wind, water, etc. So it's making me think both about my corporeality, but also the pride and joy taken by all of these bodies that are on screen. And that helps us think about gestural histories as well. Gestures of the body and then gestures of technology. How does our history change when we read it through gestures?
Speaking of invisible bodies, one of the most obviously invisible groups in the dances that we see, particularly in the 20th century, are the women who traditionally performed various forms of temple dance or court dance. And you talk about this in your book about how the mid-20th century was this period of nation making where you had upper castes and upper classes taking away forms, gentrifying them, putting them in auditoriums and later the cinema. All this while very particular communities of women were both losing their rights and also access to their own artistry in a way. So do you think there needs to be maybe a kind of reconciliation that Hindi cinema needs to do with its past in terms of this caste and class history behind its dances?
I definitely think the work that is being done in kind of forcing classical performance cultures to contend with their histories of exclusion, of violent marginalization, is something that the Bombay film industry also needs to do, and on multiple fronts. I'll just speak about respectability politics has always been part of the movement to gentrify the cinema from the 1930s and 40s. It's an interesting moment because before that, even the Hindi film heroine or the Indian film heroine in the pre-sound, there wasn't Hindi cinema. It was kind of cinema produced in different parts of the subcontinent. But the actress was often drawn from the Anglo-Indian community, the traditional performing communities in different parts of the country. But they had to gentrify cinema to appeal to a new bourgeois audience. And that's how the Bhadra Mahila in Calcutta or, the respectable lady Durga Khote is among the first Brahmin women in Maharashtra to enter films. So we see in these various industries a concerted effort to get privileged caste women, dominant caste women into the industry. Simultaneously, in the kind of performance arena of dance, there is exactly like you're saying, this marginalizing of hereditary performing women and their place being taken by middle class, dominant caste women, which is a kind of simultaneous project of making both of these fields, cinema and dance, quote unquote, respectable. And throughout the book, I kind of use respectability and classical in quotes, because the classical is an artificial category that was created by dominant caste bourgeois cultural reformers in order to marginalize hereditary performing women. And they were marginalized because of their non-conjugal sexuality, these kind of living practices that made them not fit into a bourgeois heterosexual kind of new formation of what marriage should look like. So these are very much histories that are in conversation. Hari Krishnan has an interesting book called Celluloid Classicism on Tamil cinema, and how the figure of the Devadasi actually does not disappear, but continues in cinema. You have a lot of performers whose Devadasi histories might be hidden or masked, but are participating in the film industry, sometimes become backup dancers. So these are absolutely histories that need a reckoning with, just as we're finding in performance cultures. And it also needs a reckoning with these institutions of canon formation, like the Sangeet Natak Academy, for instance. In the early 1950s, they have these seminars on dance, music, and the cinema. And you have figures like Uday Shankar arguing against film dance and saying it's a corruption of dance. But soon, a figure like Uday Shankar himself is edged out, saying his quote-unquote modern Indian dance is not classical dance. Right? So these battles for what gets crowned as classical and what gets relegated to the space of the popular are pitched battlegrounds. And figures like Sitara Devi, for example, who are shifting and moving between popular cinema and classical dance, Vaijayantimala, Padmini, Ragini, Wahida Rehman, these are all interesting figures because they're negotiating. Kamala Lakshman in the South. They're negotiating this even as their elite bodies are kind of the result, that the very fact that they are dancers in the 1950s is because of the Sanskritization, the textualization of classical dance. So we have to hold both of these tensions together, even as we're celebrating, say, the dancing of certain cinematic dancers. Alongside that is constantly the shadow figure of the other dancer who has been marginalized. So even as we celebrate the emergence of the public woman from the 30s and 40s, we know that it's always accompanied by a pushing away, a pushing out of that earlier, very cosmopolitan performing woman.
In a sense, it's a system that I guess relies on othering someone at every turn. And I think that othering is also visible in the way a lot of these song and dance sequences are picturized. For instance, whether it's Helen or you talk about Azuri, they come with being an other because of their lineage and racial history and all of that. And today in Bollywood, you see that you have the other dancers in the background. You have white women who are used to foreground, the biggest stars, whether they're male or female. So yeah, I was wondering, what is the place of this other body and the other body that is not Indian? And that is also such a contentious idea, right? Which is the Indian body. And I think at this time, there's also a reconciliation with who is the Indian person, who is the modern Indian woman. You have the classic women's question. So yeah, what is the place of the other?
That is such an interesting historical question. And I'm really glad you brought up the Caucasian backup dancers that now populate Bollywood. And I'm often asked questions about that by my students here in the US, who are often surprised, as they are surprised to see backup dancers in blackface, in quote-unquote tribal costume. These are unruly formations, right? I keep telling them you cannot fix them as just one thing or another. It doesn't fit within a US racial kind of discourse either. There is something else going on there. But this project of producing the Indian, and especially the Indian woman, as this kind of diagram of the national woman is such a fraught and concerted project in the anti-colonial movement. One is obviously it's fraught because there's so much diversity in terms of regions, right? How do you produce one Mother India? What kind of figuration will she have? We know this from our discussions of art history and Raja Ravi Verma and Phalke. There's a whole bunch of popular culture figurations of the Indian woman that together are kind of trying to produce what would be the Indian sari, what are the right ways to move and speak and cook, It's disrupting from within itself. The center cannot hold. This kind of formation is impossible to hold, as we see with the Hindutva project now. The amount of force needed to kind of produce one unitary identity and the many forces that pull against that actually make the Indian subcontinent such an interesting place to study gender and sexuality. And the others, and specifically in terms of the dancing women that I am discussing, are sometimes othered, sometimes they are at the heart of the film industry. So in the 30s, at the heart of the film industry are Jewish, Anglo-Indian, other kinds of Eurasian. Helen, for example, is Franco-Burmese. So these are, very different formations, but the national identity is still not fixed. So these are figures of spectacle, and that is what the cinema wants in that moment. These are figures that are very comfortable living and traveling through the Indian subcontinent. The Indian subcontinent is a great place for them to make a living and to have fame. Even in an earlier period, you have Eurasian women, Gohar Jan, her mother Malka Jan, are Eurasian women who take on these Islamicate names to kind of gain fame as Tawaif performing women. Right? So these are constantly shifting identities, and they're so interesting because they completely bust open the anti-colonial narrative that we have of the respectable Hindu woman who is the repository of all things that are spiritual about Indian culture, etc. Actually, the figures of spectacle who are traveling through the Nautanki stage, Jatra, all kinds of popular cultural performances are coming from all over the place. And Helen, we might think of her as an other only in relation to the Hindi film heroine. But Helen was a very powerful woman within the industry in that she had to be, every film in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, worth its salt would have a Helen cabaret number. So she was much sought after. In fact, it's a backup dancer, Anglo-Indian backup dancer called Edwina Lyons, about whom there is a self-published book, very interesting. She says, Helen was too posh and wouldn't talk to us, to the rest of us backup dancers. So this is why when we move to these shadow figures, choreo-musicking body formations, we stop thinking of Helen as the shadow figure. She is in one sense a shadow figure. Of course, she earns much less possibly. She was paid less than the heroine might have been. But then she has a much longer career than any of the heroines, right? From the 50s through the 80s, it's a 3-decade-long career. So if we shift our gaze, then we see these kind of shifting terrains of power. And Vaijayanthimala and Helen, for example, were very good friends. Both of them they gush about their love for each other. Vaijayanthimala says her only friend actually in the industry was Helen because they were both hardworking women and danced, and they would wait to dance with each other. So there's also this queer utopian kind of affiliation between these dancing women. Their desire was to dance with each other and not with some, ungainly hero in a heterosexual dance number. So it was their dance-offs between these two women, Vaijayanthimala and Padmini and Vanchikote Valiban. Those are the dance numbers that they remember. So it's also, I think, really interesting for queer formations of desire that shift when we think about these as laboring bodies that have a lot of pride in their work.
And of course, these dances that they did together also allowed them to, claim this immense agency in a system that inherently objectifies them. We have these discussions even in papers today about how Hindi cinema objectifies women. But reading your account, it seems like, it wasn't quite such a black and white situation. We also have to think of these women as artists who are expressing themselves in very particular ways with years of training behind them.
Absolutely. I think that's what we lose when we have just binary kind of frameworks to think about gender, sexuality, the place of women within industrial formations. There are filmmakers who say they made a particular film. For example, Lake Tandon says he made Amrapali only because of Vaijayantimala. So this kind of big budget, mythical courtesan production is just created around the dancing body of Vaijayantimala. That's the amount of kind of power and agency that she has within the industry, which we would lose sight of if we didn't think in terms of the labor and the virtuosity of the body, right? And there's also when we move away from these binary figurations, we also move away from these tired stories of the vamp versus the heroine, the foreground dancer versus the backup dancer. And I kind of propose them as co-choreographers. I'm not erasing power differentials between them. Like I mentioned, Helen and Vaijayantimala are placed on a certain kind of hierarchy, but I'm trying to understand Helen's pride in her work, or the backup dancer Edwina Leon's pride in her work, or Saroj Khan through her very long 5-decade career in the Hindi film industry. And one of the ways that I came to that co-choreographing kind of kinship between dancing women was through the archive. So I go in search of who might be the first figure I want to engage with, and I find Sadhana Bose, because much is made of her 1937 film Alibaba. And I say, okay, here is a woman who's an artistic pioneer. She's a choreographer, performer, on-screen star, costume designer. She has these amazing Art Deco saris you see in some of her song booklets. And she comes from a very, very quote-unquote respectable Brahmo Samaj family in Calcutta. So there is a way in which she comes with a lot of privilege, but she's also erased from our histories. And then in the archive, I find Azuri, who is also dancing at the same time, but doesn't have the same visibility that Sadhana Bose has, right? So then that shifts my kind of discussion about Sadhana Bose's agency. I, in fact, find her very visible compared to Azuri. And then it takes a few more kind of years of sitting with both of them and looking for them in the archive to realize that I can read these two women as simultaneously producing something, rather than kind of constantly be caught up with more or less privilege, because we are also not privy to the past. I'm kind of reconstructing these stories from my own position of privilege, right? So I'm also a co-choreographer with them. And all of this is just to say, I think if we're constantly conscious of our positionality and the power as well as subjection that are imbricated in those positionalities, we end up writing and telling very different histories of our past. It's a new way then of looking at even of Azuri's time in Pakistan, for example. She travels from India to Pakistan. She's a very mobile woman. So I don't think she's an other. She's kind of constantly shape-shifting and forming herself with whatever is the contemporary definition of a performing woman.
So I'm just going to end with a question that you don't really address in your book. You bring it up to the legendary Madhuri Dixit, who people, still recreate her moves until today at every wedding. But because your book doesn't really move into the 21st century, I wanted to ask you, who are the Munnis and the Sheilas in relation to all of these women that have come before them?
I love the Munnis and the Sheilas. And I feel like we haven't had a great item dance in a while now. And the pandemic hasn't helped either. But I think the item dancer is a kind of new avatar of the vamp. So I think of these as lineages of dancing women, right? A genealogy of performing women. There is Azuri, Helen, Shehzadi Begum, even before Azuri, Helen and Madhuri Dixit and Sri Devi. And then you come to Kareena Kapoor, Katrina Kaif, all of the kind of contemporary item dancers. The technological construction of the item dancer is much more apparent than it was in earlier periods. So in earlier periods, we'd say a Helen or a Vaijayantimala or a Madhuri Dixit dance number is so scintillating because these women know how to dance. More recently, with the Katrina Kaif item dance, you would say it's because the editing is so fast, because every shot doesn't last for more than 3 or 5 seconds, right? And all she has, and this is I quote Saroj Khan and the actress from the 50s, Shama, in the epilogue of the book saying, oh, nowadays you don't have to do much. In the past, we had to do an entire Antara and Mukhda in one shot. Saroj Khan says there's not much for a choreographer to do now. Everything is brought to the editing table and constructed here. But when I think about the choreo musicking body in the earlier period, in the 20th century, the body was still technologically produced. You still brought in Geva color and Technicolor, all of these Eastman color for the dancing body to produce its spectacle, right? You created certain kinds of costumes. So rather than seeing rupture, which is what most people who are critical of the item dance kind of get upset and think about this as a great break from the glorious tradition of the past. Madhuri Dixit for me is that figure who is lithely jumping, leaping from her own matkas and jhatkas from the 1990s into an item dance that she does. I'm forgetting the name of the film, but with Ranbir Kapoor. So she is kind of embracing this turn that has actually emerged from her own body. She and Saroj Khan created the foundations for what would become the item dance. So there are tensions, but there are also continuities that I find really interesting. And for me, I'm not interested in the ideological figuration of this body. So people will keep looking for agency saying, oh, at least now we also have item boys. We have boys bearing their torsos, and that makes it slightly better. But maybe we just need to shift our gaze and think about where that pleasure comes from. What kinds of bodies are looking upon these bodies? What other kinds of queer gazes are being activated by both the item boy and the item girl? And what is being erased? Your earlier question, each of these formations is also erasing something else, right? So the working class backup dancer has been completely removed from the new Bollywood film. So if you look at the backup dancers behind Madhuri Dixit and Ek Do Teen, they are a kind of completely ragtag team of people with different body shapes. The costumes are not fitting on everyone correctly. Not everyone isn't doing these hyper-synchronized Busby Berkeley kind of moves, Everyone's a little off. And that was a different globalization, kind of deregulation body that has completely been removed by Farah Khan, Shamak Davar, these kind of uniform, upper class, dominant caste, gym-trained bodies, all size 0 bodies from Dil To Pagal Hai, and now the Caucasian bodies, right? There's a uniformity that's actually taken away that frisson of the earlier unruly Hindi film backup body. So can we hold both of these? Can we hold pleasure and displeasure together rather than kind of just throw out something that we think of as ideologically suspect?
Well, thank you, Usha, so very much for a wonderful conversation. And I've learned a lot through it, and I hope everyone else will as well.
Thanks so much for having me on, Poorna. This was a wonderful conversation for me to have as well.
Thank you.
And it's the same for me, listening in, being a fly on the wall. And dear listeners, don't forget to pick up your copy of Usha Iyer's Dancing Women to learn a lot more. The link is in the episode description. And Usha and Poorna, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.